Here's a great overall question. To what extent, so how much did manifest destiny, us getting all this land, basically how much is manifest destiny a cause of sectional tension and conflict, which would lead to the Civil War? And I would say it was a watershed moment, like the Mexican-American War, the Mexican Cession. It's a watershed moment that really, it significantly increased sectionalism. Okay, so I made this yesterday. Just a recap. Remember, we get California from Mexican-American War. Okay, and then there's gold discovered in 1848. 1849, people rushed to California. Okay, and then next thing, California applies to be a free state. Okay, now here is where we left off. Southerners, they're the radicals who were like, we're going to secede. Like, California cannot be, a free state. Like, no, if California becomes a free state, we will secede from the USA. Think like John C. Calhoun, okay? Really, secessionist, radical Southerners. They're called fire eaters. And they will meet in 1850, when they hear about this, in Nashville, Tennessee, to protest California wanting to be a free state. And talking about possible secession. Okay, so do we want the nation to break away? No, we don't want it to break up. Okay, so what happens is Henry Clay, this is like his last gift to America. Remember, he's the great compromiser. He did the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise Tariff, all that kind of stuff. His last gift before he dies in 1852-ish is he will come up with and present what is called the Compromise of 1850. Okay, there are 5 parts to the compromise, and then there will be a debate about it. Okay, because again, the parts of the compromise, it's proposed, but it doesn't mean anything until it gets passed by Congress. Okay, so that's where we left off, and I need to get my notes. There is a picture of Henry Clay proposing, the Compromise of 1850. And do you almost see how there's a little bit of light shining on him? It represents, because again, he dies just shortly after this. It's like his last gift to America, preventing a civil war, or at least delaying it. But is he going to have the energy to actually really just get it through Congress? No. And so the torch will be passed to this guy right here. His name is Stephen Douglas, and he becomes a big leader in the Senate. Okay. Let me make sure I have so I can see where y'all are. Do not worry about the Zachary Taylor popular sovereignty thing. We're good. Don't worry about that. Recap Mexican Cession in 1850. This is prior to California applying to be a free state. There are 15 free states and 15 slave states. So there is a balance. Okay. Popular sovereignty proposed by, y'all remember? Lewis Cass, and that's that election of 1848, okay? And that's the idea that residents of a new territory should determine for themselves if free or not. Remember, he proposes it, but will people actually adopt that principle? And we will see. Also, another thing too, remember the Wilmot Proviso. This was a proposal when we do declare war against Mexico that suggested that the new territory from the Mexican Cession, remember we spell it with a C, should be free of slavery. It does not pass, but it just shows you the first thing on people's mind at the thought of new land is free or slave. Okay, so now we have California, the gold rush. The leaders of California will write a new state constitution, and hopefully Congress will adopt it, and that constitution will exclude or ban, it's whatever. I'm okay with synonyms. And again, so I'm going to skip down. We'll go back to Underground Railroad. But right before you see Compromise of 1850, I want you to write, Nashville Convention. The fact that people are meeting in Nashville, Tennessee in 1850 to discuss possible secession is proof that Henry Clay needs to step up and come up with one more compromise to hopefully prevent secession. Okay. Zachary Taylor, remember he's a Whig president. Okay. He does promote popular sovereignty. He is a unionist, meaning like he wants America to remain intact. And it's like, hey, let the people decide popular sovereignty, okay? But he will oppose it, but he will die in 1850. We'll talk about his death and stuff in a little bit, okay? So now, let's talk about the Triumvirate, and don't worry about background information. You know plenty about Henry Clay. You know about John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster. You should know like Webster Ashburton, Secretary of State. He also was that Webster-Hayne debate in the Senate. He says nullification's treason. Okay, those are like the three people. Like we're talking 1840s, 1850s. They are like when you think of three people in Congress, they are the three. Okay, and they do not really get along, but they are like the three most prominent people right now. Okay, does Henry Clay, and they do this little debate about the compromise, does Henry Clay like the compromise 1850? Yeah, he created it. Okay, John C. Calhoun, would he like the compromise of 1850? No. Remember, he is a Southern radical, and basically, unless you say like slavery can exist everywhere, John C. Calhoun's not going to like it. Okay, and then you have Daniel Webster. He supports the compromise 1850 because he wants national unity. National unity is number one in his book, just like with the Webster-Hayne debate. And he believes that if people don't support this compromise, that like this is going to lead to disunion. Okay, and also want to point out what's crazy is these three people will all die within like a year of each other. Okay, and then it's like, okay, who's next? Okay, well, after they give their little spill on their stance for the compromise 1850, there is a guy from New York who eventually will like basically replace one of them. Like he becomes one of the new figureheads, and his name is William Seward. And again, everyone's like, is this constitutional? Is this constitutional? Blah, blah, blah. He says, stop talking about the Constitution. There is a law that is higher than the Constitution. That is God's law. And God says no slavery. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go to the backside. Remember, I told you Stephen Douglas is the guy that actually gets it passed. What he does is called an omnibus bill. So instead of just saying, hey, compromise 1850, let's pass all these 5 parts. People are going to get mad about that. Like that. You're not going to, when there's like 5 parts to a law, that's going to be hard to get passed. So what he does is he focuses on part A, California's free state, and like tries to make it to where that gets passed. And there's like part B, slave trade in DC. You get what I'm saying? So after all 5 parts of those are passed, thus the compromise is passed. Okay. So California, there's the first thing. California admitted as a free state. Yay, Northerners, right? The Mexican Cession, how will we determine slavery or not? Popular sovereignty. Okay. Abolish the slave trade in DC. So can you have slaves in DC? Yes. Can you sell slaves in DC? No. So it's kind of, I mean, it's kind of, you know, popular sovereignty and Mexican Cession. I would put a star next to Roman numeral 4. The most controversial will be the stricter Fugitive Slave Law. Remember, the first Fugitive Slave Law was during Washington's presidency. It basically said a Southerner could go north and like reclaim their property, meaning slavery. Okay, and then there'll be a boundary dispute. Basically, just put NM for New Mexico for the first blank, NM, and then lost territory. What it is that Texas, so it's most likely going to be a slave state. It was really big. So what they did is they took a chunk out of Texas, and you can see that right here. This, like right here, and took a chunk out of Texas, and now it's called New Mexico. And New Mexico would most likely not have slaves. Okay, so you see the slave state lost some land, and the non-slave state gained some land, and then Texas will get $10 million for the land lost. So it kind of evens out. Okay, so you don't have to worry about writing things down in that box for North gained, but just note overall the Southerners will be a little bit okay. That stricter Fugitive Slave Law made them happy just enough. Okay, but it's like you can tell that in just a little bit they're going to be mad about something else. Okay, so you could argue that the North did get a better end of the deal, Okay, and here's a quote from John C. Calhoun. He said, "I trust that we shall persist in our resistance to California being a free state until the restoration of all our rights or disunion basically will be the consequence." Okay? "We have borne the wrongs and insults of the North long enough." This is after the Compromise of 1850. The reason why the Compromise of 1850 is important, it basically gives the Union a heads up. Like, you know the South's going to get mad in a couple of years about something else. So go ahead, build more, railroads, establish more telegraph wires in places and stuff. And a huge reason the North wins the Civil War is because they had 90% of the nation's industry. And again, the Compromise of 1850 delays the Civil War for about 10 years, or delays secession for 10 years. It also gives the North time to really turn up that industry in case they need to use it. Okay. Now let's talk about the Fugitive Slave Law. Again, this is really, this is going into like why it's more controversial. Okay. So now, instead of just saying a Southerner can go get, a slave up north, now it's saying if you don't, it's almost like a citizen's arrest. Like if you see a potential runaway slave, you're supposed to capture them, throw them in jail, and report it to the South, and they would come up and see if that was a slave or not. Okay. If you refuse to do that arresting of a potential slave, you could be punished. Okay. If someone sees you, let's say you see maybe a runaway slave possibly, and you kind of make eye contact, and then you just turn a blind eye, but someone else sees you turn a blind eye, you can go to jail. So do you see how it's some people abolitionists are but I don't believe in slavery, so I'm not going to arrest that person. Well, you can go to jail now. Do you see the personal liberty that might be a problem there being denied? And so it's going to be heavy prison and jail sentences for those who helped runaways. And remember, not just for harboring fugitive slaves, letting them stay in your home and stuff, but if you don't arrest them, you also are helping them. Okay. Some states will refuse to accept the law. Like Massachusetts voted, the Massachusetts state legislature voted to make it illegal to enforce this fugitive slave law. And what's that an example of? Yeah, nullification. So we always talk about the South nullifying. Well, here's an example of the North nullifying. Okay. 9 states up north will pass something called personal liberty laws. And it basically said we're closing our jails. We don't believe, if you're telling us we have to put alleged fugitive slaves in our jails, well, we're going to close the jails. So now there's not a place to put them. Okay. The Supreme Court at this time was extremely racist. Just remember that, because we'll talk about the Supreme Court tomorrow. But Roger Taney was a very racist Chief Justice. Okay. There's no other way of putting it. Okay. So the Supreme Court will upheld this fugitive slave law. Because again, in their mind, especially Roger Taney, Chief Justice, slaves are property. Slaves have no rights. Slaves will never be citizens. That's Roger Taney talking there. Okay. It's also applied to runaways from decades ago. So if you think you're safe, you're not. Okay. So just want to point out, remember we talked about our second Whig president, Zachary Taylor. He became very popular after the Mexican-American War. Okay. He is a unionist or a nationalist. He wants the nation to be together. He does respect states' rights, though, as long as you don't as long as it doesn't lead to disunion. So he probably would be against nullification. Okay. He is a Whig, so he definitely wants to, work on internal improvements. He maybe wants to get a second bank or a third bank. He was a slave owner. Okay. But he did not agree when all 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850 arrive on his desk to sign into law. He doesn't sign it into law. He just doesn't agree with it. Okay. But here's the fate. Okay. Is that Zachary Taylor will die in office. I think the Whigs have something like a hex on them or something, because if you think about it, the first Whig president was William Henry Harrison, lasted 30 days. Okay. Second Whig president, Zachary Taylor. Okay. How did he die? 4th of July. I know people have cookouts and parties and stuff, right? He was at one on July 4th. Okay. And you know, sometimes with the 4th of July, it represents like the middle of the summer. You might have like a lot of ice cream or a lot of, like, you overindulge. Okay. He overindulged. He ate a whole bowl of cherries. Okay. A whole bowl of cherries, which that can mess up your stomach already. And think about technology and the lack of in the 1800s. He drank a whole lot of unpasteurized milk. Okay. And what happened is like gastritis. The cherries, the obscene amount of cherries that he ate, mixed with the unpasteurized milk, meaning there's a lot more bacteria in that milk than what you'd have at the grocery store today, basically caused his intestines and stuff to just, yeah. And they actually thought that he was poisoned. And so they exhumed his body like 10, 20 years ago and tested it out for like arsenic and stuff. And like they said that, no, it was the cherries and milk. That's what caused him to die. Unpasteurized milk. Okay. So it's one of those things, fate. Zachary Taylor does not like he's not going to sign it into law. He dies. Millard Fillmore, the new president, who looks kind of like Alec Baldwin, he does like the Compromise of 1850 and signs it into law. So it's one of those things like, if Zachary Taylor had died, it'd be interesting to see what would have happened for the rest of the decade. So Millard Fillmore, just note, Taylor dies, so he becomes president, and then he supports the Compromise of 1850. It's all you have to write in that box. And so then it will become the law because he signs it into law. Okay? This is the third time we've talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, like, this is super important. You know, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852. It sold over 300,000 copies up north, especially. Then, because it is, I mean, it's like that thick of a book, it will be turned into a play to get to even more people. Okay, it will be banned in the South. In the South, actually, within 2 years of the publishing, so within like 1854, the South actually wrote 15 pro-slavery novels to counter the claims in this book. Okay, and during the Civil War, Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, okay? And supposedly, when he went to, like, shake her hand, he said, oh, so you're the lady who started this big war, okay? So, definitely, because it exposed, people thought that, you know, people owning people was bad, but a lot of people up north didn't know about the rape, the mixing of, like, the you know, the families and all that kind of stuff, the murder, all that kind of stuff, until Uncle Tom's Cabin. It really exposed a lot of things and opened up the abolitionists' eyes even more. Okay, we also talked about the impending crisis of the South, hence our helper. He said slavery is wrong for economics of the South, and the victims, the biggest victim would be the poor Southern whites. Okay, like I said, we've already talked about them, so you should be good. Now, this is the only, I usually try to make it the slides. I think I've done a better job with that, but I forgot to fix this. Let's go back to where it says Underground Railroad on the first page. Okay. So the Underground Railroad, y'all know, is like a nocturnal thing. You'd be on the run going to the next safe house or checkpoint at night. And then during the day, you would hide in the checkpoints. Usually it'd be like, you know, a secret bookcase that opened up a place where you would hide the floorboards. You know, you'd have like a loose one that you'd get in there and hide under, you know, underneath. And what is interesting, if you look at this map, we always know, you know, it's Canada, right? Canada's freedom. But look, too, Mexico is also freedom. There were some routes of the Underground Railroad that went to Mexico. Okay? And free blacks and runaway slaves usually ran it. A lot of abolitionists would be like the safe houses. So, for instance, there were a lot of safe houses in Pennsylvania, okay, right here. And like a lot of Quakers, like Levi Coffin. His place was like nicknamed like the Grand Central Station for the Underground Railroad because it was like, it really, they were able to harbor and get creative with a lot of hidings of fugitives. So Quakers really played a part there. The most notorious conductor of the Underground Railroad would be Harriet Tubman. Her name was Moses. And remember I told you last week she led 19 rescue missions, which would allow for over 300 runaway slaves to get to Canada. And she did this the whole time with $40,000 wanted dead or alive on her. Okay, 40 grand is a lot of money back then. Okay, then during the actual Civil War, she would actually serve as a spy for the Union Army. Okay. All right, let's see. So I told you how the great triumvirate will die 1850, 1852, and who's going to like be the new people who are going to debate. You'll have that William Seward, who's going to say God's law says no slavery. You have Stephen Douglas. He's the one who gets the Compromise of 1850 passed. He's from Illinois. Then you have Jefferson Davis, who's a Democrat from Mississippi. He's kind of like, Jefferson Davis would be like the new John C. Calhoun. Okay. All right. So now we have the election of 1852, which is that new paper. Okay. So the Whigs, think about it. By this time in 1852, Henry Clay is dead. Okay, so when your founder dies, you tend to die too, or like you lose some power. Okay. Then they decided to run Winfield Scott, who was like second most popular general in the Mexican-American War. And it's like, look, let's try this one last hurrah. If Winfield Scott doesn't win, then we might need to think about dissolving our party. Does Winfield Scott win? No. Interesting fact, my great-great-grandfather, William Alexander Graham, he was his running mate. Interesting fact. Yeah, governor of North Carolina, founder of UNC, William Alexander Graham. Okay, but my ancestor did not become the vice president because he did not win. So do you see the Whigs realize, well, our founder's dead. We gave like the best guy for the Whig party and he still didn't win. So they, in the back of their minds, they're like, yeah, we're like, this is a slow, we're eventually going to die out. Okay. Who will win is Franklin Pierce. He's a Democrat from New Hampshire. Okay. And he is considered, there's a political term called a dough face. Think dough, like you mold it. Okay. A dough face means you're a Northerner, but like you sympathize with the South. You're like, I'm a Northerner, but you know what? If you want to have slaves, go ahead, have slaves. Okay. He's like the best of both worlds. He's a Northerner, but he's okay with the South having slaves. So you see why he defeats Winfield Scott. Okay. So remember I told you what's going to happen is eventually the Whig party dissolved. There's one more thing we got to talk about that really like nails, you know, the final nail in the coffin for the Whig party. But because of this, they realize, yeah, we're on our way out. Okay. So now let's talk about the Pierce administration. Okay. Franklin Pierce, he is, a lot of historians would say he's like top 5 worst presidents. He was basically cursed from the beginning. On the train to DC, there was an accident and his son died. I mean, that's a really bad omen, you know, and I don't think the wife ever recovered from that, and I don't think he did either, okay? And then plus, you have a lot of crazy sectionalism going on, okay? So, a couple things. He did support the Compromise of 1850. There is something with Cuba, okay? Southerners wanted Cuba. Why? Potential slave state. Cuba is 90 miles south of Florida, so, and it's great. And the main natural resource that Cuba is known for at this time, sugar cane, sugar plantations, lots of money. And guess what? There are already slaves there. So we know it would become a slave state if we get it. Okay. So Southerners like want to fight. It's like, hey, we fought Mexico and we won. Let's fight Cuba and win Cuba. Okay. So what we do before we would want to declare war, there's a group of people who will send a top secret document called the Ostend Manifesto. We send it to the Cuban officials and say, look, we're willing to buy Cuba, which is pretty tiny, for $120 million, almost 10 times more of Louisiana purchase price. Okay. And Cuba, if you refuse, we'll fight you for it. Eventually, this news will leak out. And if you're a Northerner, you are outraged. One is the federal government's willing. First of all, this is all secretive, so that's sketchy. Then two, the federal government's willing to spend $120 million for a little piece of land that would benefit the South. And then three, you're also threatening to go to war if you don't get the land, which would benefit the South. Like, you're playing favorites. See that sectionalism? Okay, so next we have the Gadsden Purchase. Okay, now you saw that little clip yesterday with the 3 minutes, okay, about the Mexican-American War. What's in red is the Mexican cession, and then it said, and a couple years later, we'll purchase a little strip of land in present-day Arizona. That is during Pierce's presidency, and that's it right here, the Gadsden Purchase. It is really small compared to all this. If this is all 15 million, you think, oh, okay, maybe like 1 million, no, it's at least 7 million. But do you see, we're willing to spend a lot of money on a southern, they want to build a southern railroad. It's another example of you're playing favorites, federal government. You're trying to help out the South economically with a railroad. Okay, and it did go through. It did get purchased. The Osten Manifesto did not work out, but the Gadsden Purchase did go through. The last thing, you might just want to write this down somewhere. In the 1850s, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry leads a fleet to Japan, and we basically, like, at gunpoint say, hey, Japan, you will trade with us. We want to buy your goods because they're cheap, and you will trade with us, and if you don't, look at our military. So you see, we opened up trade with Japan, but we kind of did it by force. All right, so the last main thing we're talking about today is the Kansas Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. They're all related. Okay, I would make sure you know 1854. Okay. Stephen Douglas, remember, he's that senator who's like kind of the new Henry Clay, if you will. And he wants to provide a northern railroad, a northern transcontinental railroad with the main like hub center being Chicago, which would be his area. Okay. He knows the Northerners would want that and the Southerners would be mad, right? So what does he do is that he's going to like throw something at the Southerners first to make them happy, so then he can kind of like sneak in the railroad later for the Northerners, okay? And what would make the Southerners happy? The Kansas Nebraska Act, okay? What he does, and he's the author of this bill, he says, point one is this land right here that's in the Louisiana Purchase. Let's go ahead and turn that into 2 territories, Kansas, Nebraska. And then step 2, will slavery be there? The determining factor, popular sovereignty. Let the residents vote. Okay, so let's see. He is the author of this bill, and popular sovereignty would determine the status of slavery in these territories. Okay, now remember, popular sovereignty in this context is a pro-slavery doctrine. Because if you look at this, okay, you can see that 3630. The 3630 is right here, the Missouri Compromise. Kansas and Nebraska are both above the 3630. So if you follow the Missouri Compromise rule, should slavery be allowed? No. But this basically the Kansas Nebraska Act repeals or replaces the 3630 Missouri Compromise line, because now it's saying there is hope. If you vote to allow slavery, regardless of the 3630, you now can have slaves. So it's a pro-slavery doctrine, which would make Southerners happy. Okay, so result, the Missouri Compromise line was no longer in effect. The Whig Party will definitely splinter now, because some people are like, ooh, yeah, Cotton Whigs would be really happy. Conscience Whigs would not be happy. Okay? And then what I would do is put a box around the formation of the Republican Party. This is super important. You need to know the Republican Party that is around today formed in around 1854 solely to protest the Kansas Nebraska Act. Okay. Now remember, at this time in the 1850s, okay, there are 3 third parties that are around. Well, we'll say 3, but you have the American Party. Remember the Know Nothing parties, like anti-immigrant. You also have the Free Soil Party. Okay. Then the Whigs are technically a major party, but at this time they're not really having much luck here. Okay. They all realize that it's like strength in numbers. They're never going to get stuff done with 3 weak parties. So what are they going to do? merge and create a new party, the Republican Party. The final nail in the coffin for the Whig Party is the Kansas Nebraska Act. They realize we gotta merge with others for a new one, hence the Republican Party. Okay, the Kansas Nebraska Act, here's a very famous political cartoon. Okay, it looks like Abraham Lincoln. It's not Abraham Lincoln. Okay, and it says, forcing a slavery down the throat of a free soiler. These people right here are actually like have the hair and like forcing the guy's mouth like back, you know, so you can like open it. And then the other people are putting this, that's like Douglas right there, putting a slave down this guy's throat. And again, Kansas and Nebraska were not supposed to have slavery. But now this act says people can vote to have it or not. Okay? So what's going to happen is, you know, if people vote, that really is true democracy, right? But what can happen with voting? Fraud, cheating. Long story short, popular sovereignty in the 1850s fails miserably because people cheated. Okay, long story short, Kansas, they first tried out popular sovereignty. Okay, a lot of people in Missouri, they were nicknamed border ruffians. People in Missouri, which is a slave state, remember Missouri Compromise, they moved to Kansas next door, just enough to be there long enough to vote, and then moved back. There's stuff in the ballot box. Okay, a lot of abolitionists found out, and said, "Oh heck no," and they start moving. Okay. In the end, there will be 2 capitals in Kansas. A lot of historians will argue that the Civil War did not start at Fort Sumter. It started in Kansas a couple of years earlier. Okay, you had 2 capital cities. One capital is going to be Lecompton. Lecompton was a pro-slavery capital. Okay, another group will set up Topeka, which is an anti-slavery group. You had 2 capitals in one state or one territory, okay? And what it was is technically the pro-slavery group won the election, or I guess you could say the voting, but you see how the anti-slavery group were like, oh heck no, we're not going to acknowledge you, we're going to have our own, okay? They both wrote state constitutions and submitted them to Congress. So you see how awkward it is? There's basically a stalemate because like Pierce supported Lecompton, but Congress did not support Lecompton. So they're kind of at a stalemate. And when there's all this tension and a stalemate, what tends to happen? Violence. Okay. And so see where it says Bleeding Kansas, write a couple things in. Okay. First thing is going to be called the Sack of Lawrence. Lawrence is an anti-slavery town. Okay. And this anti-slavery town will be collecting something called Beecher's Bibles. They have these posters. Donate your Beecher's Bibles, whatever. You think it's a Bible, right? No, it's another word for gun. Okay? The pro-slavery people find out that Beecher's Bibles actually means guns. And while there's like a drive to collect the guns, the pro-slavery people attack Lawrence, Kansas, killing 2 anti-slavery people. Okay? Now, there's one more thing that involves Bleeding Kansas. A few days later, look, 3 days later, there's a white abolitionist man named John Brown. He's a white abolitionist, devout Christian. God told him that he is to get rid of slavery. He's a white abolitionist male. He is so mad about this anti-slavery town being attacked. So what does he do? He, in the middle of the night, will go to a neighboring town called Pottawatomie Creek, which is a pro-slavery town. And he will kill 5 random people in their sleep, chop them up. He did that because it's like, you're going to hurt the anti-slavery town? Well, I'm going to kill 5 random people living in the pro-slavery town. He will not be arrested because he will go like an escape to like the anti-slavery areas, and that people love him. He's a martyr. He was willing to kill to end slavery. Okay. All right. So what's eventually, and there's that picture right there is a depiction of John Brown. You will hear about John Brown again. Okay, this is not the most notorious thing he does. We'll talk about tomorrow. Okay, so the last thing, okay, remember I told you there's like a stalemate and then there's Bleeding Kansas. Eventually in 1859, Congress will accept an anti-slavery thing. So technically when Kansas does become a state, it will be a free state. but people had to die and stuff first. Okay? Any questions about the stuff we talked